This is Mike.
And this is Drew.
Welcome to the Mike and Drew at Mountain View podcast. It is March 1st, 2023, and for episode 10, we want to know, what does it mean to be a servant leader? And we have a special guest with us today, Jeff Palmer, who's lead pastor at Partnership Christian Church in Maryville, Tennessee. And you did not get lost on your way out here today, did you?
Hello, I did not. No, fortunately, that's what GPS is for.
It sometimes doesn't work out here.
I was going to say, we've had people still get lost. So
my first time out here, we didn't know where we were going.
Really?
Yeah, I was like, what is happening? Where are we going?
Well, fortunately as well, this is my second time living in the Maryville area, and the first time I lived up here, back in 2000, my parents followed me up, and they lived only maybe about half a mile from here, just off of Jericho Road. So cool. I was pretty familiar with the area in the first place.
And little did you know, one day you would be in the office of the associate minister here at Mountain View Church of Christ.
No idea.
And now you've reached the mountaintop.
This is it. I can see the mountains from here. That's almost the view of the mountain.
There's a reason why it's called Mountain View.
It's a mountain view almost. That's a wow. All right, before it gets too crazy in here, I found a little bit of trivia about you on your church's website, and one of the statements you made, I think, is highly controversial here on this podcast. And if what I'm about to say offends you and you're listening, you can send us an email at podcast at MVCC6mile.org.
Just the one podcast there.
Oh, and respond to this. Really, Jeff, I'm not sure what you were thinking when you said this. You said desserts should only consist of dark chocolate covered espresso beans or chocolate chip cookies. Do you still stand by that statement?
Absolutely. And it's actually become very beneficial for me that every lady in our church recognizes that as well. So, yeah.
That sounds dangerous.
Yeah. I don't participate in pie socials. Chocolate chip cookie socials I could participate in, but
I like that.
What about like a brownie?
Yeah, that's on the
Okay.
That's on the fringe, but
Okay.
I can do that. My daughter makes brownies. She's a really good baker, and I'll eat her stuff. But it's cooked fruit. It's the whole cooked fruit. It's just
That's fair.
Well, I know that this really ties in easily to the subject of servant leadership, because we're putting others' needs ahead of our own, and it sounds like the people at your church are practicing that by taking the lead role in making these desserts for you that they know you like because they want to serve you.
Oh, absolutely, and they do. It's funny because even when they have already planned to have something that some of the ladies know that I would prefer not to eat, they'll bring me something specific for myself. But, I'm also, to fall in line with the servant leadership, motif. I'm not averse to trying and stomaching things that I know that I don't like for the sake of my fellow brother or sister.
That's what you do.
So even when my wife is not able to jump in and take the bullet for me, which she does a lot, sometimes she'll interfere. She'll intercept. She'll intercept a plate on its way to me.
Wow.
And eat some of it, and then I feel like I can bring in my empty plate, and my only fear is that they may think that I love it and give me a second.
That's
helping.
right. That's what you don't want to happen.
Right.
Well, Jeff, one of the things that Drew and I had talked about, one reason we asked you to come do this is because you've had more ministry experience maybe than both of us combined. I don't know, but you've been serving the Lord for a while in a full-time call to ministry, and not just in the United States.
Correct. Yep. Interesting journey, honestly. I think everybody's journey is unique, but mine specifically, I was actually the second, if you want to call it a second career, second vocation pastor. I started out in aviation, the vocation of my father. I did that for 12 years and was more or less called out of aviation altogether as an industry.
Just to be clear, that means like being a pilot?
Actually, I was in maintenance.
Okay.
I started out as a technician,
cool.
And then by the time that I left, I was in management. But called out of that and into full-time ministry. Started in music and worship ministry, and then into pastoral preaching ministry as well. So yeah, and that's taken me to, from Alabama and that country down there in the South. I was paroled from Alabama in 2012, and then I was accepted a position to serve at a church in Kansas City, Shawnee, Kansas. And then from Shawnee, Kansas, we were in New Zealand for almost 5 years, and then made it back to the States in mid 2020, and found ourselves back here in Maryville, serving at Partnership.
So you've seen leadership not just in different parts of the world, but also in both a religious sector and more of what we might say is a common or secular side of things as well. And I worked aviation. I was not an engineer, but I built electrical wire bundles in Wichita, Kansas, which is the air capital of the world. I just feel like I need to say that real quick.
Wow.
I don't struggle with elitism or anything, but I love the aviation background. I've always loved airplanes. And one of the things I noticed is you see servant leaders in the business place, and they make a difference when they truly put their employees first. And we talked about this a little bit in the Quiet Quitting podcast. Was that our first one?
Episode 1.
So if you haven't heard episode 1, go back, listen to Quiet Quitting. And Drew, you had the illustration from Cracker Barrel of the manager who comes up and sees the spot. And what did you say the difference?
Oh yeah, so there's one manager who, you're cleaning up the kitchen, and there's one manager who goes, you need to get that spot right there. And then there's the other manager who goes, oh, let me get that for you. And that, there's a clear difference in the respect that I had for each of those different managers.
No doubt. And I've worked even in the secular sector as well. You see that as well in managers and leadership, supervisors that are in that same capacity. You had some when I was in maintenance that would roll up a toolbox and roll their sleeves up and help you if you were running behind on something. There were some that would sit back and keep their feet kicked up on the desk until you finished your job, and then we all went home together. But in ministry, it's the same thing. I remember kind of going through a little bit of training and all when we were preparing to move to New Zealand and to church plant and disciple make there. One of the things was kind of I guess instilled into us in some of the training was, you're going to, what does church planning look like? It's obviously going to be, meetings and conversations, disciple making, which has many different faces, teaching and preaching, but then, who's going to clean the toilet? And whenever, for us, our family, we were more or less a team of 5, just because it was my wife and I and our 3 children. But our 3 children were too young really to do anything when we initially arrived. And it was just that. It was, you just did what needed to be done, not merely for the sake of the institution, but for the sake of the people as well. And honestly, the best, I think the best example of what I saw of that. So coming out of one particular church where I was on staff, where there was, like what you were saying, Drew, there was that manager that was the very authoritative hierarchy CEO type of leader that everyone worked to serve the leader. So that was kind of my dysfunctional view of ministry. And when I started, and I say dysfunctional, is because I felt like ministry needed to mimic Jesus. I mean, he is the Lord of the church. And when I would look at Jesus and how he led and how he served, it just didn't compute to looking at the two. But then when I went to specifically the church there in Shawnee, Crossroads Christian Church, I don't mind giving them a shout out because they that really was a huge part of my journey in growing in ministry and leadership. The lead pastor there, Brad Fangman. Remember the first time I sat down for a staff meeting we had there in the little conference room, and there were 5 or 6 of us that sat around. We chatted a bit. We shared about what our ministries were doing and what the week was going to look like. And as we wrapped up the meeting, Brad jumped up and grabbed the 409 and the paper towels, and he was the one cleaning up the table and wiping down the counters and everything. And I mean, this was a church of 800 people and a fairly decent sized staff. I mean, largest church that I've ever been a part of. and the lead pastor was the first person to jump up and start serving. And I was that image has stuck with me
Wow.
forever.
Yeah, that's cool.
And while most people will say, "Oh, Brad's a great teacher, he's a great guy," to me it was Brad the servant that was the very first impression that I had.
Wow. Yeah, because when Jesus washed the disciples' feet, it is a thankless task. It's a chore that needs to be done. And in John 13, 12 through 16, in that passage, he asks them, do you understand what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord. Like you say, Brad had these other positions that were worthy, wonderful things he's doing for the Lord that he's called to do. And Jesus acknowledges that. He said, you call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For, and here it is, for I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. So Jesus grabbed the 409, he grabbed the paper towels, and yet it didn't take him down a notch in his leadership or authority. If anything else, like you just testified, it must have really changed these disciples' hearts. Now, we know he also washed the feet of Judas.
Yeah.
Okay, so it doesn't always lead to some magical transformation, but we also know that all these guys, these apostles, end up dying for Christ and end up giving their lives to the spread of the good news of Christ, and must have done it in a way that was genuine and real enough that people listened.
Absolutely.
So there's something huge to that. I appreciate you sharing that. And now what does that look like for you? Maybe give us another practical example in your ministry, or Drew, chime in, things that we have found in our smaller church ministries that we participate in now that demonstrate the servant side of leadership.
Certainly. I mean, I and like I said, going back to Brad, I mean, it's like he was a great teacher. He was a great preacher, an excellent pastor, a great friend, still is. But the thing that I always remember is that one episode. I mean, I couldn't tell you the subject of things that he preached about, 5-10 years ago, but I can remember that thing.
Yeah.
And I always reflect back on Jesus's words that a servant is not above his master. And when I think about Jesus as being my master, my Lord, I'm going, well, I need to look and see how Jesus acted and reacted in the way that he loved and served and taught, and recognize that I am not above the example that he set. So if he's, and again, going back to the way that that he loved people, like you mentioned, how he washed feet of his friends and his enemies, how he was always willing to serve first, and then they serve first without an agenda.
Yeah.
We see that even the miracles that Jesus performed, he never says, all right, profess your faith in me first and then I'll heal you. It was Jesus had compassion, he loved, he served first, and then that demanded a response from the person who was loved and served. And sometimes they came back to him and sometimes they didn't. But as far as Christ was concerned, that was not his primary obedience to the Father was to be a servant. I mean, he himself said, I've not come to be served, but to serve, and to be a sacrifice, to be that person that lays down his life for others. And for me, that's what I try to be, and I fall well short of that all the time. I mean, there's an easy place, especially the way that the institution of the church has kind of raised the level of the pastor.
Yeah.
The respect, and I'm not bashing the church for doing that, but it's just that it can easily go to our head. I mean, easily. We can easily say, well, these trivial things, these menial things are beyond me, and there are other people that will do those. But for me, I've tried to always be reminded again that saying of Jesus, servant's not above his master. So to shoulder up beside everybody in the church and to recognize that that myself and my brothers and sisters within my fellowship, we are all equal. I'm a disciple just as they are. God's equipped us and has called us to do different things. For mine, it's been teaching and discipleship, but other people have other gifts. Regardless, we're still children of God, and we're still His sons and daughters, and we're still brothers and sisters of Jesus. So, in that way, we have an equality about us in which we should be working alongside one another, shouldering up beside one another, to honor the Master, who is the Lord Jesus Christ.
Amen. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's absolutely true. And I think, Drew, I know we've talked a little bit about how we have been trained even differently than some who, going back a couple generations, were trained that you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps in ministry, and you assume you're going to be alone and isolated. And we've talked about the importance of building the kind of community you're talking about, Jeff, of community of ministers who are serving together and finding boundaries in some of that. Drew, you had something you wanted to...
Yeah, Jeff, what you said about remembering, that action of Brad, your minister, as opposed to his sermons. I talked about this in a sermon a couple weeks ago, but this idea that I was sitting in a class and the professor said, okay, write down the top 5 most influential sermons in your life. And I got maybe 4. And then, okay, now write down the top 5 influential people in your life. And I wrote down 6 or 7, and none of them were preachers. Right. So it's about the action as opposed to anything you say.
Certainly. Yep.
Because ideally, we as ministers on this podcast today, what we want to function as is a minister to ministers, knowing full well that we may never get credited in somebody's life looking back with a good memory saying, I remember when this minister or this pastor did this for me. But we hopefully are equipping other people by our example of grabbing the 409 bottle and the paper towels and doing the things to show that we see a need and we meet a need. If we need to, we can delegate if we're meeting a lot of needs, but we're not the guy you described kicking the feet up on the desk and saying we're too clean to do that. One of the things that I've noticed in trying to prepare a little bit for this, there was a bunch of different studies that centered around pastors and being stressed and ministers who are overwhelmed with too much to do, because sometimes out of good motivation we take on too many of the projects and we're afraid to delegate. And we've had that conversation on this podcast before. But one of the things that's mentioned here in an article by Barna posted April 22nd, 2022, it said over 4 in 5 pastors who haven't considered quitting, 83% say they believe in the value of their ministry. Another 3/4 feel they have a duty to stay and fulfill their call to ministry. And to me, that's at the core of what we're talking about here. Is all 3 of us in this room are called to ministry. Mm-hmm. And so that makes it worth whatever boots we've got to get muddy, whatever hands we got to get dirty, that's worth it to us. And so to me, I have not really had the thought I'm too good for a certain job. I have had the thought I don't know if I can do everything, or I have had the resentment that more people aren't helping, and then I have to have that honest conversation. Have I asked for help?
Yeah.
Have I, a servant leader is still a leader, and I still need to lead and say, here is a need. Can you please meet this? Can you please meet this? I still have to lead. And so we got to continue to help clean up where there's a need, but then we got to prioritize. And if you have simultaneous needs and somebody's saying, Mike, I need to talk to you right now, and somebody else is saying, hey, I got a flat tire. Can you help with this? And we have those situations.
Certainly.
Right? Where everything's going off at once. And at that moment, how do you prioritize and how do you delegate and how do you discern what the top priority is in the moment or the day when you got everybody asking for you?
Well, I think, it's kind of funny. You walk this fine line of being a servant, but yet not being mindful of things that lead to, or things that are birthed out of pride and arrogance. That I am the only one who can do this.
Oh, there it is.
Or I am the only one who can do this right, or it's not going to be done. That's the type of thing where we walk that fine line.
No, we're going to have to ask you to leave. You made it too personal.
Yeah, that's tough.
That was not. Brady, we're gonna scratch the whole podcast.
Yeah.
No.
And it's good. In that you see that every every opportunity presents a potential for ministry and for growth that, I think about a lot of times whenever I'm given a task or a task comes on me, who is it that it's not necessarily who is it that can get to do this for me, but who can I, who can grow alongside me by helping me do this.
Right.
Definitely.
And you know what? 95% of the time, it's never done to our standards. Like we know that this is not the way that we would do it.
Yeah.
Right.
And we have to stand back, and sometimes we pull our hair out and we grit our teeth and we go, and you know what? I wouldn't have done it that way. It got done. But at the same time, whoever that I asked to be a part of this particular task or ministry, they were doing what they did as a disciple of Jesus Christ, and they did it to the Lord.
Yes.
And I have to celebrate that.
Absolutely.
So there's so we do. We walk that fine line, and I think that really comes with a lot of prayer, discernment, just being in tune with the voice of God, and always keeping our pride and our arrogance in check, so that we recognize the things that we're doing and things that we take upon ourselves are not done out of that pride and arrogance, thinking that, well, no one else can do this as good as me or do this. I have to be the one to do this. But that we are delegating for the sake of spiritual growth. And we're praying, Lord, who can I bring alongside me? Who would you rather do this thing? And sometimes it can be simple questions like that. God, would you rather me do this, or do you want to send someone else to do this?
I've asked that question before.
well.
I get nervous and anxious, and I've got to get this, and I'm being convicted. I'm getting ready to do something out of fear and out of perfection. And Lord, does this need done? And if I believe the answer is yes, then am I the one to do it? And a lot of times it's no. Just go ahead and call so-and-so, text so-and-so. And in doing so, I've got to admit that I can't do it all.
Yeah.
And in doing so, I need to be willing to trust that person to do it the way God's led them to do it. So, Jeff, I appreciate you taking time to be out here. And I know we're at the end of the podcast and we got so much more we could talk about, but I appreciate Partnership Christian Church for sharing you, whether they knew they were sharing you or not.
They didn't, but they're probably going to find out if they hear the podcast.
I love our Blount County Area Ministers prayer group. We've been having once a month for over a year now. Is that right?
Yeah, it's been good.
And I love meeting everybody at Louisville Christian Church and Meadowbrook Christian Church, First Christian Church, and we've just and everybody at Partnership. We've enjoyed that fellowship, and I appreciate you sharing some of your experience. We hope to have you on again. I know we didn't even tap into barely any of the stories we wanted to get into, but
that's all right.
But we got your experience, and I appreciate that. And you. Drew, I've got a verse. If you have anything else that you wanted to
Go ahead.
Plug in on this, that Philippians chapter 2, verse 3 says, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves." And I think just you sharing what you have seen work in churches and what true discipleship looks like and trusting others to lead is encapsulated in that verse. And so,
for the record, you did not share that verse with me when God prompted the things for me to say about humility, because I think that's in that I see God working in unity.
Yes.
You've even you can't see it, but folks, he's got his screen turned away from me, so I can't actually see the scripture that he had picked out, and it's just I just see that affirmation. Yeah. And that is it. Yeah.
And that's what I've appreciated about you as Drew and I've gotten to know you, is you are led by Christ. You prioritize prayer. And I know you being here today, just sharing your story, just as you were led by the Spirit. And I think, again, I didn't share a script with you.
No,
right?
Not at all.
And so
I didn't even know what I was coming to talk about.
And we didn't even know. Drew and I were talking, and we said, well, we didn't do a high amount of preparation for this, because in servant leadership, this is something you don't prepare much for servant leadership. We're talking about funerals. We're talking about weddings and these things that you can do some prep work, but a lot of it is you just have to plunge in as a servant being led by Christ and be ready to lead others, but we can't lead others if we're not being led by Christ. So,
amen to that.
Jeff, thank you again. This has been Mike.
And Drew, and you've been listening to the Mike and Drew at Mountain View podcast. Email us at podcast@mvcc, the number 6mile.org. I got it right that time. Eat your vegetables.